Who was this mysterious queen who traveled thousands of miles just to test the wisdom of King Solomon? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the Bible's most captivating stories, the tale of the Queen of Sheba, a powerful ruler whose legendary meeting with Solomon would echo through history for millennia. From her opulent kingdom in the ancient world to the riddles she posed to test the wisest king who ever lived, her story is filled with wealth beyond imagination, wisdom that astounded nations, and a journey that would forever change how we understand power, faith, and the pursuit of truth. Though before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Please introduce yourself in the comments. As always, I love hearing about you. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Thank you once more for joining me. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's uncover the entire remarkable story of this enigmatic queen. The Mysterious Monarch, an introduction to the legend. In the vast library of ancient texts, few figures shimmer with such mystery as the Queen of Sheba. Her story appears in the Hebrew Bible, mentioned briefly yet powerfully. The Christian Old Testament preserves her visit. The Quran speaks of her wisdom and conversion. Three faiths share her memory, though each tells her tale differently. The biblical account offers only fragments. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes her journey to Jerusalem, laden with gifts of gold and spices. She comes to test King Solomon with hard questions. The text reveals little else about who she was or where she ruled. Yet from these spare verses, entire civilizations built legends that shaped their identity for millennia. According to Ethiopian tradition documented in the Kebra Nagast, a text compiled in the 14th century CE, she bore Solomon's son and founded a dynasty. The narrative claims this lineage ruled Ethiopia until the 20th century. Islamic sources from the 7th century CE onward name her Bilqis, a sun worshipper who recognized divine truth. Jewish texts from the early centuries of the Common Era adorned her story with riddles and magic, transforming a diplomatic visit into a contest of supernatural wits. More than a historical figure, she became a mirror. Each culture saw in her what it needed to see. Christians painted her as a wise Gentile who recognized true wisdom. Muslims celebrated her submission to monotheism. Ethiopians claimed her as their founder, the mother of kings. Jews debated whether she was human or something stranger, her very nature a puzzle to solve. The search for her kingdom has consumed scholars for generations. Two regions compete for this honor. The first lies in South Arabia, in the lands now called Yemen. Ancient inscriptions speak of the Sabaean kingdom, wealthy from trade in frankincense and myrrh. The second possibility rests in the Horn of Africa, in territories that became the Ethiopian Empire. Both regions preserve traditions of her rule. Both point to ruins as evidence. Archaeological expeditions have uncovered massive structures in both locations. The Great Dam at Marib in Yemen testifies to Sabaean engineering prowess. The temple complex at Yeha in northern Ethiopia speaks of an ancient civilization's grandeur, yet neither site offers definitive proof of a queen who visited Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE. The historical puzzle deepens when we consider the timeline. The biblical Solomon, if he existed as described, would have ruled around 9070 to 931 BCE. The Sabaean kingdom's documented power peaked later, between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. This gap of several centuries troubles those seeking a neat historical match. Perhaps the Bible conflates different periods, or perhaps the queen came from an earlier phase of South Arabian culture not yet fully understood by modern excavation. Beyond the question of location lies something more profound. Her story endures because it challenges assumptions. In ancient texts dominated by male rulers and prophets, here stands a woman who governs independently. She commands resources that impress even Solomon. She asks questions difficult enough to test his legendary wisdom. The biblical account treats her as an equal, a fellow monarch worthy of respect. The gifts she brings reveal her wealth. 1 Kings mentions 120 talents of gold, an enormous sum by any measure. Beyond gold, she carries spices in quantities never seen before in Jerusalem. The text specifies precious stones, items of immense value. Solomon reciprocates with his own gifts, and both monarchs exchange freely. This mutual gifting speaks to diplomatic protocols between powers of equal standing. Her questions remain mysterious. The Bible does not record what she asked. Later traditions filled this silence with elaborate riddles, creating entire conversations from imagination. Yet the original text simply states that Solomon answered everything she asked. Nothing was too hard for him to explain. She came seeking to test whether his fame matched reality, and she departed, convinced it did. The 8th verse of 1 Kings chapter 10 preserves her words. Happy are your men, happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. This brief speech reveals her focus. She praises not Solomon's wealth, though Jerusalem's splendor clearly impressed her. She celebrates his wisdom, the quality she came to evaluate. Her blessing extends to those who serve him, recognizing that proximity to wisdom benefits even those of lower rank. More than political theater, the encounter suggests intellectual exchange. Two rulers meet not as rivals but as minds capable of recognizing excellence. The text portrays no condescension from Solomon, no diminishment of her status. She arrives as a reigning monarch. She departs as one. The mutual respect implied by the narrative stands out in ancient literature. Her departure marks the end of the biblical account's certainty. She returns to her own land, the text states. Where that land lay remains unspecified. What happened after her return vanishes from biblical concern. The Hebrew Bible moves on to other matters, leaving her story incomplete. Yet incompleteness invited elaboration. Human minds resist unfinished narratives. Over centuries, various cultures supplied endings, beginnings, and middles to her tale. They gave her a name, though the Bible provides none. They described her appearance, her palace, her people. They imagined romance, conflict, and consequence. From a brief diplomatic visit, storytellers crafted epics. The very brevity of the biblical account may explain its endurance. With so little fixed detail, each generation could reinvent her without contradicting Scripture. She could be African or Arabian, demon or human, seductress or sage. The text silence became creative space, and that space filled with the dreams and needs of those who told her story. 3 major religious traditions claim her, yet she belongs fully to none. She stands at intersections, a figure who crosses boundaries. Her legend bridges Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Her kingdom might lie in Arabia or Africa, making her a citizen of multiple regions. She embodies both pagan origins and monotheistic conversion, representing religious transition. As a woman wielding power in patriarchal societies, she challenges gender limitations without explicitly advocating for their removal. The quest to find the historical woman beneath the legend continues. Archaeologists dig in Yemen and Ethiopia, seeking inscriptions that might confirm or deny traditional claims. Historians analyze trade routes, dating techniques, and linguistic evidence. Each new discovery generates debate rather than consensus. Perhaps no amount of digging will settle the question definitively. Perhaps the historical truth matters less than what her story has meant to millions across time. Her legacy extends beyond religious texts. She appears in medieval manuscripts, depicted by artists who never saw Africa or Arabia. Renaissance painters imagined her procession, creating scenes of exotic splendor. Composers wrote oratorios celebrating her wisdom. Modern novels and films continue to reinvent her, adapting ancient legend to contemporary concerns. Each age finds in her something relevant to its own questions about power, gender, and wisdom. The journey ahead explores all these layers. We will examine the biblical source, then venture into the geographical debate about her kingdom's location. We will hear how Ethiopia made her foundational to national identity, how Islam wove her into prophetic history, how Jewish tradition expanded her story with fantastical details. We will consider the riddles attributed to their exchange, the nature of their relationship, and her transformation into a cultural icon. At the end, we will ask what her enduring presence reveals about humanity's need for stories of powerful, wise women. She remains elusive, this queen without a certain kingdom. Yet her elusiveness proves generative. The mystery invites exploration. The gaps in her story create room for meaning. From a few verses in ancient scripture, she grew into something larger than history, becoming legend, becoming symbol, becoming eternal. The biblical encounter, 1 Kings 10, and the test of wisdom. The 10th chapter of 1 Kings opens with simple words. When the queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's fame concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. This single verse launches one of Scripture's most intriguing episodes. No prior warning prepares the reader for her arrival. She appears suddenly, fully formed as a monarch with agency and purpose. Her motivation centers on Solomon's reputation. Fame had spread beyond Jerusalem's borders, reaching distant lands where she ruled. The text specifically mentions fame concerning the name of the Lord, suggesting Solomon's wisdom was understood as divinely sourced. She comes not merely to see wealth or power, but to evaluate whether his celebrated understanding matches the stories that reached her court. The phrase hard questions tantalizes readers with its vagueness. Ancient Hebrew uses the word kadot, which can mean riddles, difficult problems, or perplexing matters. The text preserves none of these questions, leaving their nature entirely to imagination. Later traditions would fill this gap enthusiastically, but the original account maintains silence about specifics. Her arrival in Jerusalem must have created quite a spectacle. The text describes a very great caravan. She brings camels bearing spices, gold in large quantities, and precious stones. The volume of spices particularly impresses the biblical writer, who notes that never again came such abundance to Jerusalem. This detail suggests either that her kingdom controlled spice trade routes or that her gift exceeded normal diplomatic exchanges. The gold quantity receives precise measurement, 120 talents. Each talent weighed roughly 75 pounds, making the total around 9,000 pounds of gold. For comparison, 1 Kings chapter 9 states that Hiram of Tyre sent Solomon 120 talents for various projects. Her gift matches the contributions of another major trading partner, indicating her kingdom's substantial resources. Solomon's response demonstrates equal generosity. The text states he gave her all she desired, whatever she asked. Beyond specific requests, he bestowed gifts from his royal bounty. This mutual exchange follows diplomatic protocols where monarchs of similar status demonstrate their wealth through reciprocal giving. Neither wishes to appear less capable than the other. The encounter's intellectual core occurs in verse 3. Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. The verse emphasizes completeness. Every question receives an answer. No topic proves too difficult. His wisdom encompasses whatever she brings to test. Her satisfaction appears total. Beyond intellectual exchange, she observes Solomon's kingdom firsthand. The text lists what impresses her: the palace he built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants and their attire, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings at the temple. These details span both secular governance and religious practice, suggesting her evaluation was comprehensive. Her reaction, recorded in verses 6 through 9, offers rare insight into her thoughts. She begins by acknowledging her initial skepticism. The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. This admission reveals her discernment. She did not accept stories uncritically, but required personal verification. What she witnessed exceeded expectation. Not even half was told me, she declares. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard. The gap between reputation and reality, when reality proves greater, speaks to Solomon's genuine achievement. She found not a ruler inflated by propaganda, but one whose actual circumstances justified his fame. Her blessing extends to Solomon's people. Happy are your wives, happy are these your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. The text in some manuscripts varies here, with some versions reading men rather than wives, but the sentiment remains consistent. Those in proximity to Solomon's wisdom gain a privilege she recognizes and celebrates. The climax of her speech addresses the divine source of Solomon's position. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king to execute justice and righteousness. Her words acknowledge Yahweh specifically, using the covenant name of Israel's deity. Whether this indicates her acceptance of monotheism or simply polite diplomatic acknowledgement remains debated. Her theological statement proved significant. She interprets Solomon's kingship as evidence of divine love for Israel. His role exists not for personal glory, but to maintain justice and righteousness among his people. This understanding of kingship as responsibility rather than mere privilege shows sophisticated political theology. She recognizes that wise rule serves the governed, not just the governor. The parallel account in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 repeats most details but adds slight variations. Chronicles emphasizes the queen's astonishment, using language suggesting she was left breathless. The chronicler expands descriptions of Solomon's wealth and wisdom, though the core narrative remains consistent with Kings. Both accounts agree on the conclusion. After their exchange of gifts and conversation, she returns to her own land with her servants. The biblical writers show no concern for what happened after her departure. Her story serves to highlight Solomon's wisdom and the extent of his fame. Having demonstrated both, the text moves to other matters. The brevity of the account raises questions. How long did she stay in Jerusalem? Weeks? Months? The text offers no timeline. Did she travel alone as sole ruler, or did she have a husband managing affairs back home? Scripture remains silent. Did Solomon and the queen develop personal feelings beyond diplomatic courtesy? The original text provides no romantic elements whatsoever. Yet this restraint contrasts sharply with later elaborations. Ethiopian tradition would claim she bore Solomon's son. Islamic sources suggest deeper interaction. Jewish midrash creates extended dialogues and tests. These expansions all begin from the same sparse biblical foundation but build entirely different structures upon it. The historical questions multiply when examining the text's chronology. 1 Kings places this encounter during Solomon's mature reign, after his building projects were completed. If the traditional dating places Solomon's rule around 970 to 931 BCE, the visit would occur in the mid-10th century BCE. Yet archaeological evidence for a Sabaean kingdom with sufficient wealth and organization to mount such an expedition appears later, creating a chronological tension scholars continue debating. Some suggest the biblical account preserves memory of later events, backdated to Solomon's reign to enhance his reputation. Others propose that South Arabian states existed in powerful form earlier than current evidence indicates. There remains still undiscovered or unrecognized. A third view locates her kingdom not in South Arabia but in the Horn of Africa, where dating aligns more comfortably with the biblical timeline. The text itself offers no geographical precision. It names her realm simply as Sheba, using the Hebrew Sheba, which appears elsewhere in biblical genealogies and place names. Genesis chapter 10 lists Sheba among descendants of Cush, suggesting African connections. Genesis also mentions Sheba as descended from Joktan, pointing toward Arabian lineage. This dual attribution in Scripture itself reflects later uncertainties about location. What remains clear is the encounter's significance within biblical narrative. It demonstrates Solomon's wisdom reaching its zenith, recognized even by foreign royalty. It shows Israel's international prestige during what tradition remembers as a golden age. It provides rare glimpse of a powerful woman engaging intellectually with the wisest man of his generation and finding him worthy. The queen's initiative stands out. She comes because she chooses to come, driven by curiosity and the desire to test reported wisdom against reality. No military threat forces her journey. No tribute obligation requires her visit. She acts from agency, and the text treats her agency as normal and appropriate for one of her station. Their parting receives just one verse. She turns and goes to her own country, taking her servants with her. This simple conclusion suggests satisfaction on both sides. She gained what she sought, verification of Solomon's wisdom. He received honor from a distinguished visitor and added to his treasury. Both monarchs maintained their dignity and enhanced their reputations through the encounter. Yet for readers across millennia, this ending feels incomplete. The human mind resists stories that trail off without resolution. What became of her? Did she remember Solomon? Did she implement what she learned in her own kingdom? The text's silence on these questions transformed into invitation. If Scripture wouldn't provide answers, tradition would. The location of Sheba, unraveling the geography of a legend. The question haunts scholars and adventurers alike. Where exactly was Sheba? Two regions claim this ancient kingdom, each offering evidence, each attracting devoted advocates. The debate spans not just geography, but touches on identity, heritage, and the interpretation of fragmentary historical records. South Arabia presents the first candidate. The southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, in territories now called Yemen, once hosted the Sabaean kingdom. Ancient inscriptions confirm its existence. Archaeological remains testify to its wealth. Temples, dams, and fortifications speak of a sophisticated civilization. The chronology roughly aligns with biblical timeframes, though tensions exist. The Sabaean kingdom controlled vital trade routes. Frankincense and myrrh, precious resins used in religious ceremonies, and luxury goods throughout the ancient world grew in this region. Caravans carried these aromatics northward to markets in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levantine coast. Control of this trade generated enormous wealth, making the Sabaeans powerful players in regional commerce. Inscriptions in the South Arabian language preserve the kingdom's name as Saba. The linguistic connection to the biblical Sheba appears direct. These texts mention rulers, victories, building projects, and religious devotions. They reveal a society with complex administration, capable of organizing large-scale construction and maintaining trade networks across vast distances. The Great Dam at Marib demonstrates Sabaean technical achievement. Initial construction likely began in the 8th century BCE, though some evidence suggests earlier foundations. The structure controlled seasonal floods and enabled agriculture in an arid landscape, serving the kingdom for over a millennium. Its construction required engineering knowledge, massive labor coordination, and ongoing maintenance. Such capabilities suggest a state organized enough to dispatch diplomatic missions to distant Jerusalem. Roman sources from the 1st century CE refer to Arabia Felix, the fortunate or blessed Arabia. This designation reflected the region's wealth from the incense trade. Classical writers describe the Sabaeans as wealthy beyond measure, their land producing precious aromatics that commanded high prices throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The biblical description of the queen's gifts aligns with South Arabian exports. Spices feature prominently in the First Kings account. Gold and precious stones also appear. All three categories match what Sabaean merchants traded. The mention of camels fits Arabian context, where these animals served as primary transport for long-distance caravan trade. Yet South Arabia faces challenges as Sheba's location. The timeline proves problematic. Well-documented Sabaean power peaks later than Solomon's traditional dates. While some archaeological evidence suggests earlier occupation, the developed kingdom capable of mounting major diplomatic expeditions appears to consolidate after the 10th century BCE. This gap of several centuries troubles those seeking perfect historical alignment. The Horn of Africa offers the second possibility. The highlands of what became the Ethiopian Empire preserve equally strong traditions of the queen's origin. Ethiopian identity intertwines deeply with claims that she ruled from this region, specifically from Aksum in the Northern Territories. Aksum developed into a powerful kingdom by the 1st century CE, controlling trade routes between Africa's interior and Red Sea ports. Its economy likewise depended on commerce, channeling African goods northward and connecting multiple trade networks. At its height, Aksum rivaled Rome, Persia, and China as one of the world's great powers. The Ethiopian tradition, codified in the Kebra Nagast compiled in the 14th century CE, places the queen's capital in these highlands. The text calls her Makeda and claims she ruled a vast territory. After visiting Solomon, according to this narrative, she returned bearing his son, who became Menelik I, founder of the Solomonic dynasty that claimed power until the 20th century. Archaeological sites in northern Ethiopia reveal ancient grandeur. The temple complex at Yeha, predating Aksum's rise, demonstrates that sophisticated societies existed in the region before the Common Era. Massive stone structures, carefully shaped and fitted, indicate technical capability and organized labor. These ruins prove that the Horn of Africa hosted advanced civilizations in ancient times. The biblical genealogy offers ambiguous support for the African location. Genesis chapter 10 lists Sheba among descendants of Cush, a name associated with territories south of Egypt. Ancient sources used Cush to describe the region along the Upper Nile and potentially the Horn of Africa. This genealogical placement might indicate the biblical writers understood Sheba as African rather than Arabian. Trade connections between the Horn of Africa and the Levantine coast existed in antiquity. The Red Sea served as a highway for commerce, linking African ports with Arabian and Near Eastern markets. A monarch from this region could feasibly mount an expedition to Jerusalem, traveling either by sea or through Arabian territory along the coastal route. The African location faces its own difficulties. The Aksumite kingdom's documented rise occurs much later than Solomon's time. While earlier cultures existed in the region, evidence for a unified kingdom wealthy and powerful enough to dispatch a queen with lavish gifts to Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE remains sparse. The gap between Ethiopian tradition and archaeological timeline stretches even wider than in the Arabian case. Linguistic evidence provides no clear resolution. The ancient South Arabian language shares characteristics with Ethiopic languages, suggesting historical connections across the Red Sea. Migrations and cultural exchanges flowed in both directions over centuries. The name Sheba itself appears in inscriptions from both regions, though this might indicate separate kingdoms sharing a name rather than a single polity. Some scholars propose a compromise. Perhaps Sheba originally referred to South Arabian territories, but migration carried the name and traditions across the Red Sea to Africa. Others suggest that Sheba functioned more as a designation for trading networks than a specific kingdom, encompassing merchants and rulers from both regions who participated in the incense trade. The debate sometimes generates heat beyond scholarly discussion. For Ethiopians, the queen's African origin forms a cornerstone of national identity. Rejecting this claim can feel like rejecting Ethiopian heritage itself. For Yemenis, Sabaean civilization represents a source of cultural pride and connection to an illustrious past. Both nations have invested emotional and cultural capital in their claims. Modern politics complicates the question further. Tourism, national prestige, and cultural patrimony all hinge partly on these ancient connections. Governments and institutions in both regions promote their version of the Queen's story, sometimes with more enthusiasm than evidence warrants. Separating historical inquiry from contemporary concerns proves challenging. Archaeological research continues in both locations. New excavations might clarify the timeline, revealing earlier phases of development currently unknown. Undiscovered inscriptions could mention the queen directly, settling location definitively. Yet discoveries might complicate matters further, revealing unexpected connections or contradicting established theories. The truth may prove more complex than either or. Ancient kingdoms rose and fell, merged and split. Trade networks connected distant regions, cultural exchange occurred continuously. Perhaps the historical figure behind the legend drew from multiple traditions, or perhaps different queens at different times contributed to a composite memory. What seems certain is that wealthy kingdoms existed in both regions at various points in the first millennium BCE. Both controlled valuable trade goods. Both developed sophisticated societies capable of major achievements. Both left archaeological traces. The question is not whether such kingdoms existed, but which one produced the woman who visited Solomon. The quest for her kingdom has consumed considerable scholarly energy for generations. Expeditions have sought her palace, her throne, her tomb. Enthusiasts have proposed elaborate theories, some based on careful evidence analysis, others on wishful thinking. The mystery endures partly because definitive proof remains elusive. Perhaps the location matters less than what her story meant to those who preserved it. For the biblical writers, she demonstrated Solomon's far-reaching fame and wisdom. For Ethiopians, she became an ancestral figure linking them to Jerusalem and the covenant tradition. For Arab Muslims, she exemplified the journey from polytheism to monotheism. Each community found in her what it needed, regardless of where she actually ruled. The geographical question remains open. South Arabia and the Horn of Africa both offer plausible locations. Both have champions and evidence. Both face chronological challenges. Both feature in traditions preserved across millennia. Until new discoveries provide clarity, the debate continues, adding its own layer to the mysteries surrounding the Queen of Sheba. The Sabaean Kingdom, Archaeology and Incense in South Arabia. The ruins rise from desert sands, stone witnesses to vanished glory. In the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, where mountains catch seasonal rains and wadies channel water toward plains, the Sabaean Kingdom flourished. Its remains tell a story of wealth, organization, and power, built on fragrant resins that the ancient world valued more than gold. The kingdom's foundation rested on geography. The mountain slopes and coastal regions produced frankincense and myrrh, aromatic gums exuded by trees growing nowhere else in such abundance. These substances served essential roles in ancient religious practice. Temples from Egypt to Mesopotamia burned incense daily. The dead were embalmed with myrrh. Wealthy households perfumed themselves with oils containing these precious materials. Controlling the source meant controlling enormous wealth. Sabaean merchants organized caravans that traveled northward along the western Arabian coast, through oasis towns, ultimately reaching markets in Egypt, Phoenicia, and Mesopotamia. The journey spanned months, the route demanding knowledge of water sources and safe passages through hostile territory. The trade required sophisticated organization, protection from raiders, and diplomatic relationships with tribes controlling intervening lands. Ancient sources confirm this trade's importance. Roman writers mention Arabia Felix with awe and envy. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, describes the incense trade in detail. He notes the strict regulations governing harvest and transport, the religious rituals surrounding collection, and the fantastic profits merchants earned. Greek geographer Strabo provides similar accounts, emphasizing the region's wealth and the precious nature of its products. The Sabaean language, preserved in thousands of inscriptions, reveals much about this society. Written in an alphabet related to but distinct from Hebrew and Aramaic, these texts document royal decrees, building projects, military victories, and religious dedications. The inscriptions mention rulers, both kings and occasionally queens, suggesting that female sovereignty was not unknown in this culture. Several inscriptions specifically reference queens or queen mothers holding power. The term MLKT appears, indicating a female ruler rather than merely a king's wife. While these inscriptions date from periods later than Solomon's traditional timeline, they establish that South Arabian societies accepted women in sovereign roles. This precedent makes the biblical account of a visiting queen more plausible within regional cultural norms. The dam at Marib stands as the kingdom's most impressive achievement. Initial construction likely began in the 8th century BCE, though some evidence suggests earlier foundations. The structure stretched over 2,000 feet, controlling the flow of a major wadi that brought seasonal floods from the mountains. An elaborate system of sluices directed water into irrigation channels, enabling agriculture that supported a substantial population. The dam required constant maintenance. Inscriptions document repairs and improvements sponsored by successive rulers. The investment in this infrastructure demonstrates state capacity for long-term planning and resource mobilization. Only a well-organized society could maintain such a structure across generations, coordinating labor, materials, and engineering knowledge. The Sabaean capital at Marib hosted temples to the kingdom's deities. The Maram Bilqis temple, dedicated to the goddess Shams, featured massive pillared halls and decorative elements. Excavations have revealed bronze sculptures, alabaster carvings, and inscriptions testifying to the kingdom's artistic achievements and religious devotion. The temple complex served not just as a worship site, but as an economic center, receiving tithes and offerings that the priesthood managed. Beyond Marib, other sites reveal the kingdom's extent. Surwa preserves temple ruins with inscriptions mentioning various rulers. The city of Shabwa, though associated with the neighboring Hadramaut kingdom, shows similar architectural styles and cultural patterns. The entire region participated in a shared South Arabian civilization, with Saba as its most prominent kingdom for much of the first millennium BCE. Trade brought contact with distant peoples. Sabaean merchants traveled to Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Lebanon coast. They established communities in foreign cities, maintained warehouses, and negotiated with local rulers. This cosmopolitan exposure would have made the Sabaeans aware of Solomon's kingdom, his reputation, and his wealth. A diplomatic mission to Jerusalem would fit the pattern of international contact that characterized the incense trade. The gifts described in 1 Kings align perfectly with Sabaean exports. Spices, particularly the frankincense and myrrh for which the kingdom was famous, feature prominently. Gold, either mined locally or acquired through trade, flowed through Sabaean hands. Precious stones, sourced from various regions along trade routes, would have been available to a queen controlling commercial networks. The biblical description reads like an inventory of South Arabian trade goods. The presence of camels in the caravan also points to Arabian context. These animals, domesticated in Arabia and essential to desert travel, served as the backbone of the incense trade. A great caravan of camels carrying luxury goods northward to Jerusalem fits precisely what Sabaean merchants did regularly, though usually to markets rather than royal courts. Yet the timeline remains problematic. The Sabaean kingdom's well-documented phase of prosperity and power dates to the 8th through 5th centuries BCE, several centuries after Solomon's traditional reign dates. Earlier phases of settlement existed, and some archaeological evidence suggests the kingdom's roots reach deeper than once thought. However, clear evidence for the developed state capable of mounting a major diplomatic expedition in the 10th century BCE remains elusive. Some scholars argue that the biblical account preserves memory of later events attached to Solomon's reign because his era represented an idealized golden age in Israelite memory. Others suggest that Sabaean civilization developed earlier than current evidence indicates, with its formative phases awaiting discovery beneath later remains. A third view proposes that the visit came from a less developed South Arabian polity, with later scribes amplifying the queen's wealth to match Solomon's grandeur. Inscriptions mentioning queens provide tantalizing possibilities. One text from the 7th century BCE references throne women, suggesting formal positions for royal females. Another inscription mentions a queen who ruled jointly with her son. These examples, while later than Solomon's era, demonstrate that South Arabian culture permitted female sovereignty, making the biblical account culturally plausible even if chronologically challenging. The religious landscape of ancient Saba differed markedly from Jerusalem's monotheism. Sabaean inscriptions invoke multiple deities, with Almakah, Athtar, and Shams featuring prominently. The sun goddess Shams received particular devotion, reflected in temple dedications and royal inscriptions. A Sabaean queen would have been accustomed to polytheistic worship, making her praise of Solomon's god potentially significant as diplomatic courtesy or genuine religious openness. Climate patterns shaped Sabaean prosperity. The kingdom's territory caught monsoon rains that bypassed most of Arabia. This moisture supported the frankincense trees and enabled agriculture when combined with irrigation infrastructure. The environmental foundation of Sabaean wealth made it fragile. When the Marib Dam finally failed catastrophically around the 6th century CE, it contributed to the kingdom's decline, demonstrating how thoroughly prosperity depended on managing scarce water resources. The frankincense trade began declining in late antiquity as Christianity spread and reduced demand for temple incense. The rise of maritime routes also undermined overland caravans. By the time Islam emerged in the 7th century CE, the Sabaean kingdom had long since fragmented, though its ruins and memory persisted. The dam remained visible, and traditions about ancient queens lived on in regional folklore. Modern excavations continue revealing Sabaean civilization's complexity. Teams from various nations work at sites across Yemen, though political instability has interrupted research repeatedly. Each season produces new inscriptions, architectural details, and artifacts. The picture emerging shows a sophisticated society that thrived for over a millennium, its wealth enabling cultural achievements that impressed even distant observers. Whether this kingdom produced the woman who visited Solomon remains uncertain. The geographical match appears strong. The cultural fit seems plausible. The economic foundation aligns with biblical descriptions. Only the timeline creates significant doubt. Yet, absence of current evidence is not evidence of absence. Future discoveries might push Sabaean development earlier or reveal previously unknown phases of South Arabian civilization. The Sabaean kingdom stands as one of ancient Arabia's greatest achievements. Its ruins testify to human ingenuity in harsh environments. Its inscriptions preserve a culture's voice across millennia. Its trade networks connected distant civilizations. Whether or not it hosted the legendary queen, Saba deserves recognition as a remarkable society that shaped the ancient world through commerce, culture, and the fragrant smoke of incense rising from temples across 3 continents. The Ethiopian tradition, the birth of a national saga. In the highland territories that became Ethiopia, a different story took root. Here the queen's tale grew beyond a diplomatic visit into something foundational, binding national identity to ancient Jerusalem through a bloodline claimed to span 3 millennia. The Kebra Nagast, meaning glory of the kings, transformed her from a curious visitor into a mother of nations. The text emerged in its current form during the 14th century CE, compiled in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language. Yet the traditions it contains likely circulated orally for centuries before achieving written form. Monks and historians gathered scattered legends, harmonized them with biblical accounts, and created a coherent narrative that explained Ethiopia's place in sacred history. According to the Kebra Nagast, the queen's name was Makeda. She ruled from Aksum, a city in the northern highlands. Her kingdom stretched across vast territories, wealthy and powerful. When she heard of Solomon's wisdom, she decided to visit him, motivated not by diplomatic necessity, but by a desire to learn from the wisest man alive. The Ethiopian account expands greatly on the spare biblical narrative. It describes Makeda's preparation for the journey, the selection of gifts, the organization of her caravan. It details her travels through difficult terrain, her arrival in Jerusalem, and her reception by Solomon. The text imagines their conversations, giving substance to the hard questions that the Bible leaves mysterious. In the Kebra Nagast's version, Makeda stays in Jerusalem for an extended period. She learns from Solomon's wisdom, observing his judgments and listening to his teaching. She converts from sun worship to belief in the God of Israel, recognizing the superiority of monotheism. This religious transformation becomes central to her story, making her not just a visitor, but a convert who brings faith back to her own land. The narrative turns intimate. Solomon, impressed by Makeda's beauty and intelligence, desires her. According to the Kebra Nagast, he makes an agreement with her. If she takes nothing from his palace, he will make no advances toward her. She agrees, believing the promise protects her honor. Solomon then serves her highly spiced food at a feast, ensuring she becomes thirsty during the night. Water stands placed in her sleeping chamber. When thirst overcomes her and she drinks, Solomon appears, claiming she broke their agreement by taking something from his house. The technicality releases him from his promise. The Kebra Nagast describes their union without explicit detail, but makes clear that Makeda conceives a son during her stay in Jerusalem. Before her departure, Solomon gives Makeda a ring, telling her to give it to their child if she bears a son. He explains that the ring will serve as proof of the boy's paternity, allowing him to claim his heritage if he wishes. Makeda returns to Ethiopia, where she eventually gives birth to a boy. She names him Menelik, meaning son of the wise man. Menelik grows up in his mother's court, raised as crown prince and her designated successor. The text describes his intelligence and leadership abilities, traits inherited from both parents. When he reaches young adulthood, curiosity about his father grows. Makeda tells him the truth about his parentage and gives him Solomon's ring as proof. Menelik decides to journey to Jerusalem to meet his father. The Kebra Nagast narrates his travel south, his arrival in Solomon's city, and the king's recognition of his son. Solomon wants Menelik to remain in Jerusalem, potentially to inherit his throne. Menelik, however, prefers to return to his mother's kingdom, where he is already established as heir. Solomon agrees to let Menelik return on one condition. He must take with him the firstborn sons of Jerusalem's nobles and priests, establishing a new elite in Ethiopia with Israelite blood and training. This mass migration, according to the Kebra Nagast, brings Israelite religious practice, governance structures, and cultural traditions to the Ethiopian highlands. The narrative serves multiple purposes within Ethiopian identity. It establishes a direct connection between Ethiopia and Jerusalem, making the nation participant in biblical history rather than observer. It claims royal lineage from Solomon, legitimizing the ruling dynasty through descent from Israel's most celebrated king. It explains the presence of Jewish religious elements in Ethiopian Christianity, presenting them as original imports rather than later adoptions. More profoundly, the story makes Ethiopia chosen. By claiming that Makeda converted to worship of the God of Israel and bore Solomon's heir, the tradition argues that divine favor extended beyond the Levant to embrace the Ethiopian highlands. The nation becomes part of salvation history, its rulers descendants of David's line, its people recipients of covenantal blessing. The Solomonic dynasty invoked this claim continuously. From medieval times until the 20th century, Ethiopian emperors traced their lineage to Menelik first, and through him to Solomon and David. This genealogical connection provided divine sanction for their rule. Challenges to the throne could be framed as challenges to divinely ordained succession. The legend functioned as political theology, wedding earthly power to heavenly mandate. Ethiopian Christianity absorbed and promoted the tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the Kebra Nagast as sacred literature, reading from it liturgically and teaching its narrative as history. Church art depicted Makeda and Solomon, Menelik and the Ark. Festivals celebrated events from the story. The legend permeated religious life so thoroughly that distinguishing tradition from scripture became difficult for many believers. The tale resonated because it addressed identity questions. Ethiopians knew themselves as Christian but also as African, distinct from both European Christianity and neighboring Islamic societies. The Kebra Nagast provided a narrative explaining this uniqueness. Ethiopia was Christian but had its own direct connection to Jerusalem, mediated through Makeda rather than through Rome or Constantinople. The nation's faith had ancient roots predating most Christian kingdoms. Historical analysis reveals layers in the tradition's development. Elements likely originated in Jewish communities present in Ethiopia from ancient times, possibly brought by merchants or migrants from Arabia. These Jewish Ethiopians, later called Beta Israel or Falasha, preserved traditions about Israelite connections that eventually merged with Christian narratives after Ethiopia's conversion in the 4th century CE. Other elements probably derive from Christian apologetic needs. As Ethiopian Christianity defined itself against both Judaism and Islam, the story of Makeda's conversion served to demonstrate the superiority of Christian monotheism over both pagan polytheism and what Christians viewed as incomplete Jewish understanding. Her journey from sun worship to recognition of the true God paralleled Ethiopia's own religious trajectory. The timing of the Kebra Nagast's compilation also matters. The 14th century saw the Solomonic dynasty restored to power after a period when the Zagwe dynasty ruled Ethiopia. The new rulers needed to justify their claim to the throne. The Kebra Nagast provided exactly this justification, documenting their descent from Solomon and thus their rightful place as Ethiopia's sovereigns. Political utility shaped the text's final form, yet political motivation does not automatically mean fabrication. Traditions typically contain some historical kernel, however obscured by elaboration. The question becomes whether any genuine connection existed between ancient South Arabia or the Ethiopian highlands and Solomon's Jerusalem. Trade routes connected these regions. Cultural exchange occurred. A diplomatic visit from a southern queen to a northern king remains historically plausible, even if the dramatic elements added later are fictional. Archaeological evidence for the Kebra Nagast's narrative remains limited. Axum itself does not appear as a major center until the 1st century CE, nearly a millennium after Solomon's era. Earlier settlements existed in the northern Ethiopian highlands, but evidence for a unified kingdom powerful enough to dispatch royal missions to Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE has not been found. The chronological gap between tradition and archaeological record stretches wide. Some Ethiopian scholars argue that excavations have barely scratched the surface. The highlands contain numerous unexcavated sites. Future discoveries might reveal earlier phases of development, pushing the timeline of Ethiopian state formation backward. They point to sites like Yeha, with its pre-Christian temple, as evidence that sophisticated societies existed earlier than skeptics acknowledge. The geographic logic of the Ethiopian claim rests partly on alternative interpretations of biblical geography. Some Ethiopian traditions identify the land of Cush, mentioned in Genesis, as the Ethiopian highlands rather than Nubia alone. They argue that Sheba could refer to territories in the Horn of Africa rather than South Arabia. Linguistic connections between ancient South Arabian languages and Ethiopic support the possibility of migration or cultural exchange across the Red Sea in antiquity. Modern Ethiopian identity remains deeply tied to the Makeda tradition. The story appears in schools, in popular culture, in national symbolism. The Lion of Judah emblem that adorned the Ethiopian flag drew directly from the claimed Solomonic lineage. Even after the monarchy's end in the 1970s, the narrative continued to shape how Ethiopians understood their place in world history. For the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the tradition carries theological weight beyond national pride. It explains why Ethiopian Christianity has distinctive features, such as observing certain Old Testament practices alongside New Testament worship. The claim that these practices came directly from Jerusalem via Menelich's companions provides a historical rationale for maintaining them, despite pressure from other Christian traditions to conform to Roman or Byzantine norms. The tradition also empowers Ethiopian Christians in interfaith contexts. When surrounded by Islamic societies, Ethiopian Christians could point to Makeda's story as evidence of their ancient standing and divine favor. When engaging with European Christians who sometimes questioned African Christianity's authenticity, Ethiopians could claim a connection to Jerusalem as old as or older than European conversions. Makeda herself became a symbol beyond the historical questions. She represented wisdom, seeking wisdom, humility despite power, openness to truth. Her willingness to travel great distances to learn from Solomon modeled the proper attitude toward knowledge. Her conversion demonstrated that recognizing truth requires overcoming cultural conditioning and accepting revealed wisdom. In Ethiopian iconography, Makeda appears majestic and dignified. Artists portray her with dark skin, elaborate dress, and crown. She stands as an equal to Solomon, not subordinate. Their encounter represents meeting of peers, not superior instructing inferior. This visual tradition reinforces her status as worthy predecessor to a great lineage, a queen whose qualities justified the nation that claimed descent from her union with Solomon. The Ethiopian tradition transformed a brief biblical episode into an epic spanning generations. From a diplomatic visit, it created a love story with dynastic consequences. From a nameless queen, it fashioned Makeda, mother of nations. From a religious encounter, it forged a claim to chosenness that sustained a people through centuries of challenge and change. Whether historically accurate or not, the tradition's power derives from meaning rather than fact. It gave Ethiopians a story explaining who they were and why they mattered. It connected an African Christian kingdom to the sacred geography of the Middle East. It validated a dynasty and a church. It created a heroine whose legacy shaped national consciousness. In these functions, the tradition succeeded completely, regardless of what a time-traveling historian might observe in 10th century BCE Jerusalem or Aksum. The Son of Wisdom, Menelik I, and the Ark of the Covenant. The most audacious claim in the Ethiopian tradition concerns not the queen herself, but her son. According to the Kebra Nagast, Menelik I did more than inherit his mother's throne and his father's wisdom. He brought to Ethiopia the greatest treasure of ancient Israel, the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-covered chest that held the tablets of the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. The narrative describes Menelik preparing to return from Jerusalem to his mother's kingdom. The young nobles who accompanied him from Ethiopia and the Israelite noble sons who would accompany him back all felt conflicted about leaving Jerusalem. The city held sacred significance, housing the temple where God's presence dwelt. Departing meant separating from this spiritual center. Azariah, son of Zadok the high priest, proposed a solution. According to the Kebra Nagast, he suggested they take the ark itself to Ethiopia. The plan seemed impossible. The ark resided in the temple's Holy of Holies, guarded and revered. Only the high priest could approach it, and then only on Yom Kippur. Removing it would constitute not just theft, but sacrilege. Yet the text claims they accomplished exactly this feat. While Solomon and Jerusalem slept, Azariah and his companions entered the temple, removed the ark, and replaced it with a replica. They loaded the genuine ark onto a wagon and transported it to where Menelik's caravan prepared to depart. By the time anyone discovered the substitution, Menelik's party had already traveled far from Jerusalem. When Solomon learned what happened, according to the Kebra Nagast, he pursued them. Divine intervention prevented him from catching them. The text claims God approved of the ark's transfer, having chosen Ethiopia as the new dwelling place for the sacred object. Solomon's pursuit failed, and he returned to Jerusalem, where the replica remained in the temple. The people of Jerusalem never realized they no longer possessed the genuine ark. This narrative solves a genuine historical puzzle. The ark disappears from biblical record after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Second Temple sources never mention the ark being present when the temple was rebuilt. Scholars debate what happened to it, with theories ranging from Babylonian looting to priestly concealment. The Ethiopian tradition offers its own answer. The ark never fell to Babylon because it had already resided in Ethiopia for 4 centuries. The Kebra Nagas describes the ark's journey to Ethiopia as miraculous. The caravan traveled with supernatural speed, covering in days what should take months. The ark's presence made the journey easy, smoothing rough paths and enabling the travelers to move as if flying. This miraculous element emphasizes divine approval of the transfer, framing what might otherwise seem like theft as fulfillment of God's plan. Upon reaching Ethiopia, Menelik established the ark in a temple built to house it. The text describes this temple as constructed following the pattern of Solomon's temple, maintaining proper dimensions and sacred geography. Ethiopian worship practices adapted to accommodate the ark's presence, blending Israelite temple traditions with local customs. The claim that Ethiopia possesses the ark continues to the present day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church teaches that the ark resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. A single guardian monk appointed for life watches over it. No one else may see the ark. Photographs are forbidden. Even the patriarch of the Ethiopian Church cannot view it. Only the guardian has access. This absolute secrecy makes verification impossible. Skeptics note that unfalsifiable claims prove nothing. If no one can examine the object, no one can determine whether it genuinely is the ancient ark or something else entirely. The Ethiopian Church responds that the ark's sanctity requires such protection. Allowing scientific examination would constitute desecration. Every Ethiopian Orthodox Church contains a tabat, a replica of the ark's tablets. During festivals, priests process through streets carrying tabats, which are otherwise kept in each church's Holy of Holies. This practice, unique to Ethiopian Christianity, reflects the influence of the ark tradition on Ethiopian worship. The central role of the tabat in liturgy demonstrates how thoroughly the ark narrative shaped Ethiopian Christian identity. The annual Timkat festival celebrates Jesus' baptism, but also commemorates the ark's journey to Ethiopia. Priests carry tabats to bodies of water where baptisms occur. The processions mirror descriptions of the ark's procession in Israelite tradition. The festival draws enormous crowds, testifying to the ark tradition's continuing vitality in Ethiopian religious life. Historians approach the ark claim with skepticism. No evidence independent of Ethiopian tradition supports the idea that Menelik took the ark to Ethiopia. The story appears nowhere in biblical or extra-biblical Jewish sources from ancient times. The first clear references to the Ethiopian ark claim emerge more than a millennium after Menelik allegedly lived. The chronology also presents problems. If Menelik lived during Solomon's reign around the 10th century BCE, and if he took the ark then, the ark would have been absent from Jerusalem for 4 centuries before the Babylonian conquest. Yet biblical books written during those centuries mention the ark in the temple. Chronicles, written after the Babylonian exile, describes the ark's placement in Solomon's temple, without hinting that it later disappeared and was replaced by a replica. Some scholars suggest the ark tradition developed to explain observable differences between Ethiopian worship and other Christian traditions. Ethiopian Christians observe Saturday Sabbath alongside Sunday worship. They maintain dietary laws similar to Jewish kosher rules. They practice circumcision. These practices resemble Old Testament commandments more than typical Christian traditions. Claiming possession of the ark provided narrative justification for maintaining these practices. The tradition may also reflect Jewish influence on early Ethiopian Christianity. Jewish communities existed in the region from ancient times, possibly including priests or Levites who brought temple traditions with them. These communities may have possessed sacred objects that local tradition eventually identified with the ark itself. Over centuries, such local traditions could merge with the Menelik narrative, creating the current form of the claim. Political factors likely contributed as well. A kingdom claiming to possess the ark gained immense prestige. The ark represented God's presence, divine favor, and connection to the covenant. Ethiopian rulers could cite the ark's presence as proof that God had transferred chosenness from Israel to Ethiopia. This theological claim buttressed political authority, making the ark tradition valuable, regardless of its historical accuracy. The question of what actually resides in the Church of Mary of Zion remains unanswered. The current chapel housing the supposed ark dates only to the 1950s, though earlier structures occupied the site. The extreme secrecy means that even if something very old resides there, its identity cannot be confirmed. It could be an ancient artifact from various periods and traditions, or it could be a more recent object given sacred status. Some Ethiopian Orthodox believers worry that scientific examination might prove the ark is not genuine, undermining faith. Others argue that faith requires no physical proof. Whether or not the object in Aksum is the biblical ark matters less than what the tradition means to Ethiopian Christianity. The ark claim symbolizes Ethiopia's connection to sacred history, its status as chosen people, its preservation of ancient truths. The tradition has also generated alternative theories. Some treasure hunters and alternative historians claim the ark resides elsewhere, citing various evidence that usually crumbles under scrutiny. The ark has been located in Ireland, Zimbabwe, southern France, beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and many other places. These claims typically reflect the claimant's desire for significance rather than serious historical analysis. For mainstream historians and archaeologists, the ark's fate remains unknown. It may have been destroyed when Babylon sacked Jerusalem. It may have been hidden by priests before the destruction, and its location subsequently lost. It may have been a symbolic object whose physical existence mattered less than its meaning, explaining why its absence from the Second Temple caused no recorded crisis. The Ethiopian claim represents one tradition among many regarding the ark's fate. What cannot be disputed is the tradition's impact on Ethiopian identity. The claim that Ethiopia houses the ark shaped national consciousness for centuries. It reinforced the Solomonic dynasty's legitimacy. It explained and justified distinctive Ethiopian Christian practices. It gave Ethiopians a story, placing their nation at the center of salvation history rather than its periphery. Menelik himself became a culture hero in this tradition. He embodied the union of African and Israelite wisdom and strength, Old Covenant and New. His establishment of the Ethiopian kingdom as heir to Israel's covenant created a framework for understanding Ethiopia's place in the world. As founder of the Solomonic line, he anchored a dynasty that would rule with brief interruptions for 3,000 years, according to its claims. The story also elevated Makeda retroactively. She became not just a queen who visited Solomon, but the mother of a founder. Her journey to Jerusalem set in motion events that transformed Ethiopia's destiny. Her wisdom in recognizing Solomon's greatness and her openness to his God made her worthy to bear the son who would carry the ark to its new home. Whether fact or fiction, the Menelik and Ark narrative demonstrates how powerfully stories can shape identity. The tradition gave Ethiopians a past that explained their present and guided their future. It created continuity between ancient Israel and modern Ethiopia. It made an African Christian kingdom participant in biblical events rather than belated convert. In these ways, the tradition succeeded completely, establishing itself as foundational to Ethiopian consciousness, regardless of what actually occurred in 10th century BCE Jerusalem or Aksum. The Islamic narrative, Bilqis, the sun worshipper and wise ruler. The Quran tells her story differently. In Surah An-Naml, the chapter named for ants, she appears as Bilqis, ruling a wealthy kingdom in the south. The narrative emphasizes her wisdom, her initial polytheism, and her eventual recognition of divine truth. Islamic tradition expanded this Quranic foundation, creating a detailed portrait of a queen whose journey from sun worship to submission represents the Islamic message in miniature. The story begins not with the queen, but with a bird. Prophet Suleiman, the Islamic name for Solomon, possessed power over birds and animals, able to understand their speech and command their obedience. One day he noticed the absence of the hoopoe bird, called the hudhud. Angry at this unexplained absence, Suleiman threatened severe punishment unless the bird had a valid excuse. When the hoopoe returned, it explained its journey. It had flown to a distant land where a queen ruled over a prosperous people. These people and their queen worshipped the sun instead of Allah. The hoopoe described their wealth and the queen's magnificent throne, but emphasized their theological error. They prostrated to the sun rather than to the creator of the sun, a crucial distinction in Islamic theology. Suleiman tested the hoopoe's report. He gave the bird a letter to deliver to the queen. The letter contained an invitation to submit to the one true God and to cease sun worship. The Hupi flew south, found the queen in her palace, and delivered the message. Bilqis, upon receiving Suleiman's letter, demonstrated the wisdom for which Islamic tradition celebrates her. Rather than responding with anger or immediate rejection, she consulted her advisors. The Quran preserves her question, "O nobles, advise me in my affair. I would not decide a matter until you are present with me." Her council responded according to their nature. They emphasized their military strength and readiness to fight if she commanded, yet they deferred the final decision to her judgment. This exchange reveals both the queen's consultative leadership style and the reality that ultimate authority rested with her despite the presence of strong nobles. Bilqis chose diplomacy over war. She decided to send gifts to Suleiman, testing whether his demand for submission stemmed from greed or genuine religious conviction. Gifts would satisfy a merely ambitious king but would not impress a true prophet. Her strategy showed political sophistication, using resources to gain information before committing to either submission or conflict. The messengers returned with her gifts rejected. Suleiman sent word that he would come to her land with forces she could not resist, and he would expel her and her people in disgrace if they did not submit. This threat forced Bilqis to decide. She chose to journey to Jerusalem herself, preferring to meet Suleiman directly rather than waiting for invasion. Before her arrival, Suleiman asked his court who could bring him the queen's throne before she arrived. An Ifrit, a powerful jinn, offered to bring it before Suleiman could rise from his seat. Yet another figure, described as one who had knowledge from the scripture, claimed he could bring the throne in the blink of an eye. Instantly, the throne appeared before Suleiman. This miraculous transport demonstrated divine power granted to Suleiman. Islamic commentators debate the identity of the figure who moved the throne, with some suggesting it was Asaf, Suleiman's vizier, while others propose it might have been the angel Jibril. Regardless of who performed the miracle, its purpose was clear: to demonstrate to Bilqis that Suleiman's power came from Allah rather than merely human resources. Suleiman ordered the throne disguised, changing certain features to test whether the queen would recognize it. When Bilqis arrived, Suleiman asked if this was her throne. She replied diplomatically that it was as if it were hers, demonstrating both her intelligence in recognizing the impossibility of her throne being present and her courtesy in not accusing her host of deceit. The crucial test came when Suleiman invited her to enter his palace. The floor appeared to be water, and Bilqis lifted her garment to avoid getting wet. Suleiman explained that the floor was actually glass, polished so smoothly it resembled water. This moment of confusion led to recognition. Bilqis realized she had been mistaken about the nature of reality, just as she had been mistaken in worshiping the sun rather than its creator. The Quran records her declaration, "My Lord, indeed I have wronged myself, and I submit with Suleiman to Allah, Lord of the worlds." This submission represents the central point of the Islamic narrative. Bilqis recognized divine truth, abandoned polytheism, and entered monotheistic faith. Her journey from sun worship to Islam parallels the journey Muhammad would later call the peoples of Arabia to make. Islamic tradition expanded these Quranic elements significantly. Various commentators and storytellers added details about Bilqis's appearance, character, and later life. Some traditions claim she married Suleiman, though the Quran does not mention this. Others describe her returning to her own land to rule as a Muslim queen, teaching her people the faith she had accepted. The glass floor incident generated particular elaboration. Some traditions claim that Suleiman constructed the glass floor specifically because he had heard the queen had hairy legs or goat-like feet, possibly indicating demonic ancestry. The glass floor would reveal the truth by forcing her to lift her garment. Other versions suggest the glass floor symbolized deeper spiritual vision, the ability to see past appearances to essential reality. Later Islamic sources sometimes identified Bilqis's kingdom as Saba, connecting the Quranic narrative with the biblical Sheba. This identification created continuity between the two traditions while maintaining Islamic distinctives. The queen remained the same figure, but Islamic revelation provided the true understanding of her theological significance. The hoopoe bird became a symbol in Islamic culture. Its ability to see truth that others missed and its role as messenger between prophet and queen made it represent spiritual insight. Sufi poets sometimes use the hoopoe as a metaphor for the soul seeking divine truth, drawing from its role in the Bilqis narrative. Islamic interpreters emphasize different aspects of the story for different purposes. Some focused on Bilqis's wisdom, using her consultation with advisors as a model for Islamic governance. Others highlighted her submission, presenting her as an example of how even powerful rulers must bow before divine truth. Still others examined Sulayman's power over nature and jinn as evidence of how Allah grants authority to his prophets. The narrative also addressed gender. Bilqis ruled effectively despite being female, consulting wisely and making sound decisions. However, some hadith traditions suggest that female rule is generally inadvisable, creating tension with the Quranic portrait of Bilqis as a capable queen. Islamic scholars have debated how to reconcile these elements, with interpretations ranging from seeing Bilqis as an exceptional case to arguing that the hadith applies to specific contexts rather than absolutely. The story's placement in Surah An-Naml connects it thematically with other narratives in that chapter. The surah begins with ants, whose speech Sulayman understands, emphasizing his prophetic gift of communication with creation. The ant that warns its colony to hide from Sulayman's approaching army demonstrates wisdom and care for community. This sets up the contrast with Bilqis and her people, who, despite human intelligence, worshiped creation rather than creator until enlightened. For Muslims, the Bilqis narrative reinforces core theological messages. Polytheism, even when culturally sophisticated and materially prosperous, constitutes fundamental error. Wisdom means recognizing this error and submitting to monotheistic truth. Prophets like Sulayman carry divine authority that transcends worldly power. Submission to Allah represents the only rational response to clear evidence of his power and lordship. The story also demonstrates Allah's mercy. Bilqis received warning through the hoopoe, opportunity to respond through Sulayman's letter, and clear signs through the moved throne and glass floor. She was not destroyed for her polytheism, but given chances to recognize truth. When she finally submitted, she was accepted. This pattern reflects Islamic teaching about Allah's desire for human guidance rather than punishment. Artistic and literary traditions in Islamic civilization depicted Bilqis frequently. Persian miniatures showed her throne, her meeting with Sulayman, and her recognition of truth. Poetry referenced her story to illustrate themes of wisdom, submission, and transformation. She became a standard figure in Islamic cultural memory, recognized across different Muslim societies. Modern Islamic feminists sometimes point to Bilqis as evidence that Islam respects female leadership. She appears in the Quran as a wise, effective ruler whose femininity does not prevent her from governing well or recognizing religious truth. This reading challenges more restrictive interpretations of women's roles in Islamic society, though debates about her example's applicability to modern contexts continue. The theological function of the Bilqis narrative within Islamic scripture cannot be overstated. She represents the peoples who lived in ignorance before receiving prophetic guidance. Her journey from polytheism to monotheism models the response Islam calls for from all humanity. Her wisdom in recognizing truth when presented with clear evidence demonstrates that rational minds should accept Islamic teaching. Her submission despite her power shows that status and wealth provide no excuse for rejecting divine guidance. Islamic tradition thus transformed the biblical queen into Bilqis, giving her a name, a theological journey, and a place in prophetic history. The changes from the biblical account are significant. The focus shifts from testing Solomon's wisdom to demonstrating divine power and the necessity of submission. The encounter becomes less about intellectual exchange between equals and more about a prophet guiding a polytheist to truth. Yet both traditions agree on her wisdom, her wealth, and the transformative nature of her encounter with Solomon Sulayman. The Jewish expansions, demons, riddles, and a hairy leg. Jewish tradition, never content with scripture's brevity, decorated the queen's story with elaborate additions. From the Targum Sheni, a medieval Aramaic translation and expansion of the Book of Esther, to various midrashic collections and Talmudic references, rabbinic literature transformed the spare biblical account into a rich tapestry of wonder, wisdom, and warning. The second Targum, composed sometime between the 7th and 10th centuries CE in the Babylonian Jewish community, provides the most extensive Jewish elaboration. Though technically a commentary on Esther, it includes a long digression about Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, using her story to illustrate Solomon's wisdom and power. This medieval text became the primary source for Jewish legends about the queen that circulated widely in subsequent centuries. According to these expansions, Solomon learned of the queen's existence through supernatural means. He commanded all birds to appear before him, and the hoopoe arrived late with news of a distant queen who ruled a land of great wealth. This element, also present in Islamic tradition, suggests possible shared sources or mutual influence between Jewish and Islamic storytelling communities in medieval times. The Jewish traditions gave the queen a name, or rather several names. Some sources call her Bilqis, the same name used in Islamic tradition. Others call her Makeda, connecting to Ethiopian tradition. Still others refer to her simply as the Queen of Sheba, without providing a personal name. This multiplicity of names reflects different Jewish communities, preserving different versions of the tradition. The hairy leg legend originates in these Jewish sources. According to the Targum Sheni, Solomon heard rumors that the queen had hairy legs, or possibly feet like a goat. This peculiarity suggested she might be a demon or half-demon, as demons in Jewish folklore were often said to have animal features, particularly goat-like feet. Solomon needed to determine the queen's nature before receiving her. The glass floor served as Solomon's test. He constructed a floor of clear glass overflowing water in his palace. When the queen entered and saw what appeared to be deep water, she lifted her garments to wade through. This revealed her legs, which were indeed hairy. Seeing this, Solomon's advisors prepared a depilatory cream which removed the hair and confirmed that despite this unusual feature, she was fully human. Other versions of the hairy leg tradition explain it differently. Some suggest the hairiness resulted from her mother having been a jinn, making the queen half-demon. Others claim it was a natural condition that Solomon's wisdom enabled him to remedy. Still others interpret the hairiness symbolically rather than literally, representing something about her spiritual state or her origins in pagan lands. The demonic association appears in several Jewish texts. One tradition claims that demons ruled her kingdom before she did, or that she herself had demonic characteristics inherited from her ancestors. These elements reflect Jewish folk beliefs about demons and foreign lands. Regions beyond Israel, especially those known for polytheistic worship, were sometimes imagined as demon-haunted or demon-ruled. Yet Jewish tradition also emphasized the queen's wisdom and virtue. Despite potential demonic heritage or unusual physical features, she possessed a keen mind and genuine spiritual seeking. She came to test Solomon with hard questions, and the tradition delights in imagining what those questions might have been. The riddles attributed to their exchange became a major feature of Jewish storytelling about the encounter. One famous riddle asks, "What water neither comes from the sky nor springs from the earth, yet it sustains all living things?" Solomon answers, "Sweat." Another poses, "There is an enclosure with 10 doors. When one is open, 9 are shut. When 9 are open, 1 is shut." Solomon replies, "The womb, which has 10 openings. When the child lives in it, 9 are closed and 1 is open. When the child is born, 9 open and 1 closes." These riddles, found in Midrashic collections compiled over many centuries, demonstrate Jewish intellectual culture's love of clever wordplay and wisdom literature. They portray both the queen and Solomon as masters of riddle solving, engaging in contests that test not just knowledge, but creative thinking and perception. The riddles often contain multiple layers of meaning, from mundane to mystical. Some traditions claim the queen brought Solomon gifts beyond those mentioned in Scripture. She supposedly presented him with peculiar tests alongside the gold and spices. One story tells of her bringing him groups of boys and girls dressed identically, challenging him to determine which were which. Solomon scattered nuts before them, and the boys gathered them greedily, while the girls collected them modestly in their garments, revealing their genders. Another test involved her presenting Solomon with bouquets of flowers, some real and some artificial, but so cunningly crafted that they appeared identical. Solomon could not immediately tell the difference. He ordered the windows opened, and bees flew in, going directly to the real flowers and ignoring the artificial ones. Thus, even when his own wisdom proved insufficient, Solomon's understanding of nature provided the answer. These tests emphasize Solomon's wisdom as multifaceted. He possessed not just intellectual knowledge, but practical understanding, not just learning, but cleverness, not just information, but insight into nature and human behavior. The Queen's tests revealed all these dimensions, and Solomon's successful responses demonstrated why his wisdom was legendary. Jewish tradition also elaborated on the Queen's religious state. Some sources suggest she worshipped the sun, moon, or morning star before encountering Solomon. Her conversion to belief in the God of Israel becomes a significant element, though different texts handle this with varying emphasis. Some present a dramatic conversion, while others suggest she already believed in God but came to deepen her understanding. The relationship between Solomon and the Queen generated speculation. Some Jewish texts hint at romance or even marriage, though others maintain a strictly formal diplomatic relationship. The Targum Sheni describes Solomon composing a poem comparing the queen to a beautiful deer, suggesting emotional attraction. Whether this attraction was consummated remained a matter of debate and interpretive choice among different authors and communities. The question of progeny appears in some Jewish sources, though less prominently than in Ethiopian tradition. A few texts mention that the queen bore Solomon a son, sometimes identified with the biblical figure Nebaioth, or connected to Arabian tribes. These references remain minor in Jewish tradition compared to the elaborate genealogies of the Kebra Nagast. Later Jewish mystical tradition, particularly Kabbalah, sometimes interpreted the Queen of Sheba allegorically. She represented the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of divine presence, coming to unite with masculine wisdom represented by Solomon. In this reading, their encounter symbolized cosmic harmonies and the integration of complementary divine attributes. The literal historical encounter became a template for understanding spiritual realities. The elaborate Jewish traditions about the queen served multiple purposes. They entertained, demonstrating storytelling skill and imagination. They educated, using her story to teach about wisdom, discernment, and proper worship. They warned, with the demonic elements cautioning about the spiritual dangers of foreign lands and foreign women. They inspired, showing how even a pagan queen could recognize divine truth when properly encountered. The variations across different Jewish texts reflect the diverse communities that preserved these traditions. Babylonian Jews told different details than Palestinian Jews. Medieval European Jewish communities added their own elements. Each community shaped the tradition according to its concerns, questions, and cultural context. The queen became a figure onto whom various Jewish communities projected their understandings of foreignness, femininity, wisdom, and the relationship between Israel and surrounding peoples. Modern scholars recognize these Jewish elaborations as products of their time rather than historical records. The Targum Sheni dates to many centuries after the events it describes, drawing from folk tradition and imaginative expansion rather than preserved historical memory. The riddles reflect medieval Jewish literary forms rather than 10th century BCE conversations. The demonic elements express folk beliefs about foreign lands rather than actual characteristics of the historical queen. Yet, understanding these traditions as later developments does not diminish their cultural importance. For centuries, these Jewish elaborations shaped how Jewish communities imagined the Queen of Sheba. They influenced Christian and Islamic traditions through cultural exchange. They demonstrate the generative power of brief scriptural narratives, how gaps in texts invite elaboration, and how each generation fills those gaps according to its own concerns and imagination. The Jewish traditions gave the queen depth, personality, and peculiarity. She became more than a diplomatic visitor. She became a character with mysterious origins, supernatural tests, and a complex relationship with Solomon. Whether facing riddles or revealing hairy legs, she remained central to a story that taught about wisdom's nature, the encounter between Israel and the nations, and the proper response to divine truth encountered in unexpected forms. The test of riddles, wisdom as a battle of wits. The hard questions remain Scripture's greatest mystery regarding the Queen of Sheba. The Bible mentions them but preserves none. This silence created space that storytellers across centuries enthusiastically filled. The riddles attributed to the queen's encounter with Solomon reveal less about 10th century BCE history than about what different cultures valued as wisdom and how they imagined contests of intellect between powerful figures. Jewish tradition excelled at creating riddles for this encounter. The Midrash and Targum contain dozens of exchanges, each designed to demonstrate both the difficulty of the challenge and Solomon's superior insight. These riddles follow patterns common in wisdom literature, where surface simplicity masks deeper meaning and correct answers require perceiving hidden connections. One category of riddles deals with natural phenomena. The queen asks about water that neither falls from the sky nor springs from the ground. Solomon identifies sweat, the moisture the body produces. Another riddle questions what never enters a house yet is found in every room. The answer is light, streaming through windows but never physically entering as an object. These riddles test observation skills and the ability to think beyond literal interpretations. Biological riddles form another category. The womb riddle mentioned earlier asks about an enclosure with 10 doors, where one open means 9 shut, and vice versa. Solomon's answer demonstrates knowledge of human anatomy and reproduction. Another biological riddle asks about something that comes from the earth, yet the earth does not consume it. When buried, it consumes the earth. Solomon answers human beings who are formed from earth but whose burial involves consuming space within it through decomposition. Mathematical and logical puzzles appear frequently. One riddle presents Solomon with 2 groups of people, identical in appearance, asking him to determine which group consists of circumcised men and which consists of uncircumcised. Solomon places the Ark of the Covenant before them. Those who bow reverently are circumcised Jews, while those who merely observe politely are uncircumcised foreigners. The riddle tests not mathematics but wisdom in revealing hidden distinctions. Gender identification tests recur across traditions. Besides the nuts test mentioned earlier, another version has Solomon observing how different groups wash. Men splash water on their faces boldly, while women take water in their hands first before applying it. These tests reflect cultural assumptions about gendered behavior, but also demonstrate Solomon's keen observation and understanding of human nature. Plant and nature riddles challenge botanical knowledge. The real versus artificial flowers test shows Solomon using indirect methods rather than direct knowledge. He cannot immediately distinguish the artificial from the real, so he employs bees whose nature drives them to real flowers. This demonstrates wisdom as knowing one's limitations and finding alternative solutions rather than pretending omniscience. Theological riddles address deeper questions. One asks what existed before creation. Solomon answers, God's wisdom, citing Proverbs which describes wisdom as present before the world's foundation. Another asks what makes the poor rich and the rich poor. Solomon responds, charity, which enriches the giver spiritually while requiring them to part with material wealth. These riddles move beyond clever observation to probe metaphysical and ethical truths. Some riddles take narrative form. The queen tells stories with puzzling elements and asks Solomon to explain them. One tale describes a house filled with gold, where everyone who enters takes some, but the gold never diminishes. Solomon identifies this as a house of learning, where knowledge is the gold that everyone takes, yet remains abundant. The metaphorical interpretation demonstrates wisdom as seeing past literal details to underlying meanings. Riddles about objects and their uses test practical knowledge. What speaks without a mouth, hears without ears, answers though it has no voice. Solomon identifies an echo. What grows without life, lacks roots yet increases, has no mouth but consumes all. The answer is fire. These riddles parallel wisdom traditions found across ancient Near Eastern cultures, suggesting shared intellectual heritage. The structure of these exchanges matters beyond specific content. They establish a pattern of challenge and response, question and answer, test and triumph. The queen poses difficulties. Solomon resolves them. Each successful answer reinforces his wisdom. Each riddle she creates demonstrates her own intelligence. The contest becomes mutual display of intellectual prowess rather than hostile competition. Islamic tradition also developed riddle exchanges, though with different emphases. Some Islamic sources preserve riddles similar to Jewish versions, suggesting cross-cultural transmission of these traditions. Others create new riddles that reflect Islamic theological concerns. One Islamic riddle asks what is most precious yet free, most powerful yet invisible. Sulaiman answers, faith in Allah, which costs nothing yet provides everything, cannot be seen yet moves mountains. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast includes riddle contests but focuses less on specific riddles than on their outcome. Makeda tests Solomon with questions, he answers satisfactorily, and their intellectual exchange leads to mutual respect. The text emphasizes the meeting of minds more than the content of specific challenges, fitting its focus on relationship and dynastic consequences rather than wisdom demonstration alone. Medieval European Christian writers also created riddles for the queen's encounter with Solomon. These often combined biblical themes with courtly love traditions popular in medieval literature. One Christian riddle asks, what ladder reaches from earth to heaven? Solomon answers, prayer, which ascends from humanity to God. Another asks, what king rules without subjects? The answer is Christ, who reigns supreme regardless of human recognition. The purpose of these riddles varies by tradition and context. For Jewish audiences, they demonstrated the superiority of Torah wisdom over Gentile philosophy. Solomon's ability to answer every question proved that wisdom rooted in knowledge of God surpasses all other learning. The queen's impressed departure testified to Judaism's intellectual achievements. For Islamic tradition, the riddles illustrated prophetic knowledge granted by Allah. Sulayman's answers came not from human learning alone, but from divine guidance. The queen's conversion after their exchange demonstrated that recognizing divine truth requires both intellectual honesty and spiritual openness. Her questions tested understanding, and his answers provided proof of prophetic authority. Christian interpreters saw the riddles as prefiguring Gentile recognition of Christ. The queen represented the nations coming to Jerusalem to find wisdom. Solomon, as precursor to Christ, offered wisdom that transcended earthly knowledge. The riddle exchanges symbolized how questions of philosophy and ethics find resolution in divine revelation. Her satisfied departure paralleled Gentile conversion after encountering Christian truth. Modern scholars recognize these riddles as literary creations rather than historical records. They reflect the intellectual cultures that produced them, revealing what different societies valued as wisdom. The riddle's content draws from folklore, proverbial wisdom, and philosophical speculation common to various ancient and medieval cultures. Their attribution to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba lent them authority and provided narrative framework for their preservation. The form of wisdom displayed in these riddles also carries significance. Riddles require lateral thinking, the ability to see connections others miss, and freedom from literal interpretation. They value cleverness, observation, and the capacity to perceive meaning beyond surface appearance. These qualities define a particular understanding of wisdom that emphasizes intellectual agility over rote learning. Gender dynamics in the riddle contests deserve attention. A woman challenges a man intellectually, posing questions difficult enough to test his legendary wisdom. Despite Solomon's ultimate triumph in answering every question, the tradition grants the queen intellectual standing. She is not merely beautiful or powerful, but genuinely wise, capable of formulating challenges that require Solomon's full attention and ability. This portrayal contrasts with many ancient texts where women rarely engage men in intellectual discourse as equals. The Queen of Sheba, in riddle tradition, stands as a notable exception. Her questions legitimate her wisdom. Her satisfaction with Solomon's answers demonstrates her capacity to recognize correct responses. She judges his wisdom, and her judgment validates it. This grants her authority unusual for female figures in ancient literature. Yet the contests also reinforce hierarchy. Solomon never fails to answer. The queen never stumps him. His wisdom proves superior, confirming the biblical statement that nothing was too hard for him to explain. The contests allow her intelligence while ultimately subordinating it to his. She represents the best wisdom the Gentile world can offer, but even this falls short of wisdom grounded in knowledge of Israel's God. The riddles also served educational purposes. Communities used them to teach children and students about logic, natural observation, and theological truths. Memorizing riddles and their answers trained minds in wisdom traditions. The narrative framework made abstract lessons concrete and memorable. Young people could imagine themselves in Solomon's position, testing their ability to solve problems like the legendary king. The multiplication of riddles across centuries shows how generative the biblical gap proved. Each storyteller felt free to add new riddles, contributing to a growing corpus. No canonical list existed, allowing endless variation. Different manuscripts preserved different riddles. Oral tradition generated new ones spontaneously. The Queen of Sheba's hard questions became a category that expanded infinitely. Some riddles clearly derive from local folklore unrelated originally to Solomon. A clever folk riddle would be attached to the famous encounter, lending it prestige while preserving it in collective memory. The biblical frame provided a repository for collecting wisdom traditions from diverse sources. Solomon and the Queen became characters in an expanding saga that absorbed regional intellectual heritage. The riddles also reflect changing historical contexts. Medieval riddles incorporate contemporary knowledge and concerns unknown in ancient times. Theological riddles reflect doctrinal debates of their era. The content shifts subtly across centuries, with each generation's riddles revealing its preoccupations and intellectual style. The tradition remained living rather than fixed, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining connection to the biblical encounter. Modern retellings continue creating new riddles. Children's books about Solomon and the Queen of Sheba invent age-appropriate puzzles. Novels and films create dramatic riddle contests to add tension and display character intelligence. The tradition persists, showing that the appeal of wisdom displayed through clever question and answer remains strong across cultures and time periods. At their core, the riddles transform the biblical hard questions into something tangible. Scripture's silence about specifics frustrated readers who wanted to know exactly what the queen asked. Traditions responded by filling that silence with riddles that demonstrated the kind of wisdom Solomon possessed. Whether historically accurate or not, they achieved their purpose, making concrete the abstract claim that Solomon's wisdom exceeded all others. The riddle tradition also humanizes both figures. Solomon becomes not just a wise king, but a puzzle solver, working through challenges one by one. The queen becomes not just a curious monarch, but an engaged intellectual, genuinely testing and learning. Their encounter feels more real, more dynamic, more interesting when populated with specific exchanges rather than vague references to unspecified questions. The legacy of the riddle tradition extends beyond specific puzzles. It established a template for how wisdom gets demonstrated through intellectual contest. It showed that questions matter as much as answers, that formulating good riddles requires wisdom comparable to solving them. It made the encounter between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba an archetype for meetings between different intellectual traditions, where genuine exchange can occur despite differences in origin or belief. A romantic and political union, deconstructing the relationship. Beyond riddles and wisdom contests lies a more intimate question. What exactly was the relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba? The biblical account remains strictly formal, describing a diplomatic exchange between equals. Yet later traditions, unable to resist the potential drama, explored romantic and political dimensions only hinted at in Scripture. The biblical text provides no romantic elements. The queen visits, tests Solomon's wisdom, expresses satisfaction with what she finds, exchanges gifts, and departs. Nothing suggests physical intimacy or emotional attachment. The relationship appears entirely professional, a meeting between two monarchs conducted with appropriate diplomatic protocol. If romance existed, the biblical writers showed no interest in recording it, yet human imagination reads between lines. A powerful queen travels immense distances to meet a legendary king. Both possess wealth, intelligence, and authority. They spend time together, conversing, and sharing wisdom. The ingredients for romance seem present even if the text explicitly describes none. Later traditions seize these elements to construct narratives the Bible never tells. Ethiopian tradition most explicitly develops romantic themes. The Kebra Nagas describes Solomon's desire for Makeda, his stratagem to seduce her, and their union producing Menelik. This narrative transforms a diplomatic visit into a story of attraction, albeit one involving deception. Solomon wants her, manipulates circumstances to overcome her resistance, and succeeds. The text treats this as neither villainous nor entirely honorable, simply as what happened. The Ethiopian narrative serves dynastic purposes. Menelik's birth legitimizes the Solomonic dynasty's claim to rule Ethiopia. Romance becomes functional, explaining how the bloodline established. Yet the story also reflects human interest in the possibility that these two impressive figures might have felt mutual attraction. Power, wisdom, and wealth all supposedly serve as aphrodisiacs. Why wouldn't these monarchs desire each other? Islamic tradition shows more restraint regarding romance. Some Muslim sources suggest Solomon wished to marry the queen after her conversion. A few mention that they did marry, with Bilqis remaining in Jerusalem or returning to her kingdom with ongoing connection to Solomon. Most Islamic sources, however, focus on theological transformation rather than personal relationship. Her submission to Allah matters more than any romantic involvement with Sulaiman. Jewish tradition splits between restraint and elaboration. Some midrashic texts hint at attraction, describing Solomon composing love poetry about the queen. The Targum Sheni includes verses comparing her to a gazelle, beautiful and graceful. Yet other Jewish sources maintain complete propriety, presenting their relationship as purely intellectual and diplomatic. Different communities and eras emphasize different aspects. The possibility of marriage deserves examination. Solomon's many wives and concubines are well documented in Scripture. 1 Kings states he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Adding one more, especially a queen of significant status and wealth, would not have seemed remarkable. Yet Scripture never lists the Queen of Sheba among his wives, and she returns to her own land rather than remaining in Jerusalem. Political considerations might have prevented marriage. Solomon already maintained alliances through marriages to Egyptian, Moabite, Edomite, and other foreign princesses. Another foreign wife could have been diplomatically useful, cementing alliance with a wealthy southern kingdom. However, the queen's need to return to rule her own land would complicate such an arrangement. Ancient monarchs who married often saw one party subordinated to the other's authority. Between two sovereign rulers of equal status, marriage might prove politically awkward. The exchange of gifts itself carried political meaning beyond romance. In ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, gifts demonstrated wealth, established status, and created obligation. The queen's lavish presence tested whether Solomon's reputation matched reality. Solomon's reciprocal gifts maintained his dignity, proving he could match her generosity. This mutual gifting created a relationship of equals, neither subordinate to the other, both acknowledging the other's status. Some scholars interpret the entire encounter as formalizing a trade agreement. The queen controlled incense routes from South Arabia northward. Solomon commanded access to Mediterranean markets and possessed wealth from his own trade networks. A diplomatic visit could establish terms for mutually beneficial commerce. Romance need not factor into such negotiations, though it wouldn't necessarily preclude it either. The queen's independence stands out across traditions. She rules in her own right, not as regent for a son or widow of a deceased king. She makes decisions without needing male approval. She travels where she wishes and returns home when she chooses. Even in traditions describing her union with Solomon, she maintains autonomy. She doesn't become his subordinate, but remains a sovereign who happened to bear his child. This independence complicates romantic readings. Modern sensibilities celebrate autonomous female figures, making the queen's sovereignty appealing. Yet romance in ancient contexts often involved women losing independence through marriage. The queen's story resists this pattern. Even when traditions grant her a romantic relationship with Solomon, they don't transform her into a traditional wife, subsumed into her husband's identity. The intellectual nature of their encounter also affects how we understand their relationship. They engage primarily through conversation, through questions and answers. The biblical account emphasizes exchange of wisdom over any other form of intimacy. Later traditions adding romantic elements usually still maintain this intellectual foundation. They're attracted to each other's minds as much as or more than to physical beauty. Medieval courtly love traditions influenced Christian retellings of the relationship. These European narratives imported contemporary concepts of refined love between noble figures into the ancient story. The queen became a courtly lady, Solomon a chivalrous king, their encounter a meeting of sophisticated souls. This overlay of medieval values onto ancient narrative created versions of the story that reflect European cultural assumptions more than ancient Near Eastern realities. Artistic depictions reveal evolving interpretations. Medieval paintings often show the queen kneeling before Solomon, emphasizing his superior status. Renaissance art sometimes portrayed them as equals, facing each other across symmetrical spaces. Romantic period paintings occasionally suggested emotional connection through gesture and gaze. Each era projected its understanding of relationships between powerful men and women onto the ancient encounter. Modern feminist readings complicate traditional interpretations. Some celebrate the queen as an autonomous female figure who engaged Solomon intellectually without losing independence. Others critique traditions describing Solomon's seduction as normalizing manipulation. The Kebra Nagast's account, where Solomon tricks the queen into breaking her oath so he can claim her sexually, troubles contemporary readers concerned with consent. What medieval audiences might have read as clever becomes problematic when examined through modern ethical lenses. The question of progeny carries political weight beyond romance. If the queen bore Solomon's child, that child potentially had claims to both kingdoms. The Ethiopian tradition makes exactly this claim, with Menelik inheriting his mother's throne while maintaining connection to his father's lineage. This dual inheritance creates a bridge between regions, bloodlines, and traditions. The child embodies union even if the parents remain separate. Yet most traditions describe the queen returning alone to her land. The biblical account explicitly states this. She came from her own country, visited Jerusalem, and went back. The completeness of her return suggests no ongoing relationship. Whether she bore Solomon's child or not, she resumed her independent rule without apparent need for his continued involvement. The diplomatic interpretation perhaps makes most historical sense. Two rulers of comparable status meet, assess each other, exchange gifts that cement goodwill, and return to their respective kingdoms with positive impressions. Trade relationships might develop, cultural exchange might continue, but each maintains sovereignty over their own territory. Romance need not complicate this arrangement. Still, the romantic possibilities persist in retellings. Something about these two figures invites speculation about personal feelings beyond political calculation. Perhaps precisely because the biblical text says nothing about romance, readers feel free to imagine it. The gaps in Scripture become spaces for projection, where different audiences insert the relationship dynamics they find meaningful or compelling. The relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba thus exists in multiple versions across different traditions. Strictly diplomatic in Scripture, it becomes romantic in Ethiopian tradition, potentially marital in some Islamic sources, hinted at in Jewish texts, and interpreted variously in Christian retellings. Each version serves the needs of the community preserving it, whether legitimizing dynasties, illustrating theological points, or simply satisfying human interest in whether these impressive figures might have loved each other. What seems clear is that they respected each other. The biblical text emphasizes mutual gift-giving, successful communication, and the queen's expressed admiration for Solomon's wisdom. Whatever else occurred, the encounter left both parties satisfied. She returned home having confirmed his reputation. He gained honor from her visit and praise. Whether or not romance bloomed, respect certainly did, making their relationship notable regardless of its precise nature. The enduring icon, the Queen of Sheba in art and culture. The queen's image proliferated across centuries and continents. Artists who never saw Arabia or Ethiopia, who knew nothing of ancient Sabaean civilization, nevertheless painted her. Composers wrote music celebrating her encounter with Solomon. Writers from medieval times to the present have reimagined her story. She became a cultural icon whose appeal transcended the religious texts that introduced her. Early Christian art rarely depicted the queen. The first Christian centuries focused on New Testament scenes and martyrs. Old Testament figures appeared mainly as types prefiguring Christian truth. The Queen of Sheba emerged slowly in Christian iconography, gaining prominence particularly in medieval times when her visit came to symbolize Gentile recognition of divine wisdom. Medieval manuscripts illuminated the queen's arrival in Jerusalem. She appears leading caravans laden with treasure, meeting Solomon in his palace, and kneeling before him in reverence. These images emphasized her exotic origin through clothing, retinue, and sometimes darker skin tone. Artists used her foreignness to highlight the universal appeal of Solomon's wisdom, which attracted even distant monarchs. The meeting between Solomon and the Queen became a standard subject in Christian churches. It appeared in stained glass windows, carved on cathedral doors, and painted in frescoes. The scenes served typological purposes, with the Queen representing the church or Gentile believers coming to recognize Christ, prefigured by Solomon. Medieval theologians drew elaborate parallels between her journey and the Christian spiritual journey toward truth. Renaissance painters brought new sophistication to depictions of the Queen. Piero della Francesca included the legend of the true cross in his fresco cycle, incorporating a scene where the Queen kneels before wood from Solomon's palace that would eventually become Christ's cross. This complex theological layering made her part of Christian salvation history, connecting Old Testament type to New Testament fulfillment. Baroque art amplified the drama. The Queen's procession grew more elaborate, her gifts more spectacular, Solomon's court more magnificent. Artists like Claude Lorrain painted vast landscapes with the Queen's caravan winding toward Jerusalem. The emphasis shifted from theological symbolism toward depicting exotic splendor and ancient grandeur. Beauty and spectacle competed with religious meaning. Music discovered the Queen's story. George Frederick Handel composed the oratorio Solomon in 1748, with the Queen appearing in the third act. Her arrival prompts a famous sinfonia, and she sings arias praising Solomon's wisdom and Jerusalem's beauty. Handel's music captures both majesty and intimacy, creating a musical portrait that emphasizes her dignity and discernment. Charles Gounod composed La Reine de Saba in 1862, an opera that added romantic drama to the legend. The opera includes invented characters and conflicts, transforming the biblical encounter into 19th century romantic tragedy. While taking liberties with tradition, it demonstrated the Queen's continued relevance to contemporary artistic concerns and her malleability as a character adaptable to different genres. Literature embraced her across centuries. Medieval romances incorporated her into Arthurian legends and Crusader chronicles. Islamic literature featured her in poetry and prose. Ethiopian hagiographies celebrated her as ancestral mother. Each literary tradition adapted her to its own aesthetic and thematic concerns, making her a truly international literary figure. Modern novels continue reimagining her. Historical fiction attempts to reconstruct her life based on archaeological and historical research. Fantasy literature invents magical elements around her legend. Feminist retellings emphasize her agency and power, reclaiming her from traditions that subordinated her to Solomon. Contemporary Ethiopian literature explores what her legend means for national identity in a post-colonial world. Film and television discovered the Queen in the 20th century. Solomon and Sheba, a 1959 Hollywood epic, dramatized their encounter with lavish sets, thousands of extras, and romantic embellishment. The film reflects 1950s Orientalism, depicting ancient lands through Western fantasy. Despite historical liberties, it introduced the Queen to mass audiences unfamiliar with biblical or traditional accounts. More recent screen adaptations attempt greater cultural sensitivity. Some films consult Ethiopian and Yemeni scholars, trying to respect how communities connected to the legend understand her. Others focus on specific traditions, such as Ethiopian cinema exploring the Kebra Nagas narrative, or documentaries examining archaeological evidence for the Sabaean kingdom. Visual artists continue finding inspiration in her story. Contemporary painters depict her in various styles, from realist reconstructions attempting historical accuracy to abstract interpretations exploring symbolic meaning. African and African diaspora artists particularly engage with her image, reclaiming a figure sometimes whitewashed in European art and asserting her importance to African heritage. The Queen appears in popular culture beyond fine art. She features in children's books teaching biblical stories. She appears in video games set in ancient worlds. Musicians across genres reference her in lyrics. Fashion designers create collections inspired by imagined aesthetics of her court. She has become shorthand for exotic female power, wisdom, and mystique. Each cultural moment found different aspects of her story relevant. Medieval Christians saw her as a type of the church. Renaissance humanists appreciated her as an intellectual equal to Solomon. Romantic era artists emphasized exotic splendor. 20th century feminists celebrated her autonomy. 21st century postcolonial thinkers examine how her legend has been appropriated and can be reclaimed. Her visual representation evolved significantly across time and place. Ethiopian art consistently portrays her as African, with dark skin and features reflecting local populations. This representation asserts Ethiopian claims to her heritage and resists European attempts to depict her as Mediterranean or Middle Eastern. The visual politics of how artists render her skin tone, features, and dress carry implications for who gets to claim her legacy. European medieval and Renaissance art often depicted her as racially ambiguous or even white, despite acknowledging her Southern origin. This whitening reflected both artistic conventions and cultural assumptions about beauty and nobility. Later European art sometimes exoticized her, depicting her with deliberately African or Arabian features to emphasize her otherness. These varying approaches reveal more about European attitudes toward race and foreignness than about historical realities. Islamic art traditionally avoided human depiction, but Persian miniatures created exceptions for historical and legendary figures. Some Persian manuscripts illustrate the Bilqis narrative with detailed paintings showing her throne, her meeting with Suleiman, and her conversion. These images follow Persian artistic conventions, making her visually Persian despite her Arabian or African origin in the narrative. Art transformed her into familiar forms while telling her unfamiliar story. The cultural iconography surrounding her includes specific symbols. Camels represent her journey and Arabian connection. Gold and spices symbolize her wealth. Crowns emphasize her royal status. The throne appears frequently, particularly in traditions emphasizing Suleiman's miraculous transport of it. These symbols create a visual vocabulary allowing immediate recognition of her story across different artistic contexts. Her presence in churches and religious art served pedagogical purposes. Illiterate believers could recognize her story through visual depiction and learn its religious significance. The scenes taught about wisdom, proper worship, and the relationship between earthly and divine authority. Art became scripture for those who couldn't read text, making her story accessible across literacy levels. Modern museum exhibitions have explored her legend from various angles. Some focus on archaeological evidence for Sabaean civilization, displaying artifacts from Yemen that contextually connect to her legend. Others examine artistic representations across cultures, showing how different traditions visualized her. These exhibitions make academic research accessible to public audiences while celebrating cultural heritage connected to her story. Tourism industries in Ethiopia and Yemen both capitalize on her legend. Sites associated with traditional accounts attract visitors interested in ancient history and religious heritage. The Church of Mary of Zion in Aksum draws pilgrims and tourists partly because of the Ark tradition connected to Menelik. Ruins of the Merib Dam attract visitors curious about Sabaean civilization. Her legend generates economic as well as cultural capital. Academic conferences and scholarly publications continue analyzing her cultural impact. Folklorists examine how her story transmits across generations. Art historians trace iconographic developments. Literary scholars analyze narrative adaptations. Religious studies experts explore her theological significance in different faiths. Her legend generates ongoing scholarly interest, making her relevant to contemporary intellectual discourse. The enduring fascination with the Queen of Sheba reflects multiple factors. Her story combines elements that capture imagination: power, wisdom, wealth, mystery, and cultural exchange. She represents possibilities for female authority in ancient contexts where such authority was rare. She embodies encounter between different civilizations, making her relevant to discussions of cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Her incompleteness in biblical text allows creative freedom. With so little fixed detail, artists and writers can reimagine her endlessly without violating established tradition. She becomes a canvas for projection, adaptable to whatever meanings different eras and cultures need from her. This flexibility ensures her relevance across changing historical circumstances. From medieval illuminations to contemporary films, from Handel's arias to modern novels, the Queen of Sheba persists as cultural icon. Each generation finds in her something worth portraying, like whether theological lesson, romantic heroine, symbol of female power, or embodiment of cross-cultural encounter. Her journey from ancient text to enduring legend demonstrates how stories transcend their origins, becoming vehicles for human concerns that span centuries and continents. Beyond the myth, the legacy of a powerful woman. At Journey's End, questions remain. Did she exist? Where did she rule? What actually happened in Jerusalem? The quest for historical certainty about the Queen of Sheba continues frustrating those who demand definitive answers. Yet perhaps certainty matters less than legacy, and her legacy shines undeniably across 3 millennia. The historical reality probably lies somewhere between legend and invention. Ancient kingdoms existed in both South Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Trade networks connected these regions with the Levant. Diplomatic exchanges between distant monarchs occurred regularly in the ancient world. A queen ruling a wealthy southern kingdom and visiting Jerusalem to establish relations with Solomon fits within historical possibility, even if specific details remain unverifiable. Archaeological work continues in both Yemen and Ethiopia. Each excavation season produces new inscriptions, architectural remains, and artifacts that illuminate ancient South Arabian and East African civilizations. While no discovery has yet definitively located the Queen of Sheba's kingdom or confirmed her visit to Jerusalem, the absence of proof is not proof of absence. Future finds might clarify what current evidence leaves uncertain. More likely, the historical truth will remain elusive. Too much time has passed, too little direct evidence exists, too many political and cultural factors shape interpretation of what evidence does survive. The archaeological record rarely provides the kinds of specific historical confirmation that legends require. We may never know with certainty whether a queen from Sheba visited Solomon in 10th century BCE Jerusalem, yet it doesn't diminish her significance. Historical existence proves less important than cultural impact. The Queen of Sheba shaped how millions of people understood wisdom, power, gender, and cultural exchange. Whether she physically journeyed to Jerusalem matters less. How her legendary journey illuminated truths about human seeking, the meeting of civilizations, and the recognition of excellence across differences. Her enduring power derives partly from her uniqueness. Ancient texts rarely feature women wielding independent political authority, engaging men as intellectual equals, and commanding resources that impress even wealthy kings. She stands out in scriptural and historical accounts as exceptional. This exceptionality made her useful for various purposes, but also genuinely inspiring for those seeking examples of female capability in leadership and learning. Ethiopian identity wove itself around her legend so thoroughly that disentangling national consciousness from the Makeda tradition proves impossible. For centuries, Ethiopian emperors claimed descent from her son. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church structured its theology partly around claims of possessing the ark she brought. Ethiopian literature, art, and popular culture all reference her constantly. She became foundational to how Ethiopians understood themselves and their place in world history. The Islamic tradition made her a model of proper response to prophetic authority. Bilqis represents those who, upon encountering clear evidence of divine truth, abandon false beliefs and submit to Allah. Her story teaches that wisdom means recognizing truth when confronted with it, that power and wealth don't excuse polytheism, and that female rulers can govern effectively while remaining open to religious guidance. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary Islamic discourse. Jewish tradition used her to explore questions about wisdom's nature, the relationship between Israel and surrounding nations, and the complexities of foreign women in Israelite contexts. The elaborate midrashic expansions demonstrate Jewish intellectual culture's creativity and its comfort with multiple interpretations coexisting. She became a character through whom Jewish communities could think about foreignness, conversion, and the boundaries of Israelite identity. Christian interpretation made her a type of the church, Gentile believers, or wisdom-seeking Christ. Her journey prefigured Christian conversion. Her gifts symbolized what believers bring to God. Her recognition of Solomon's wisdom paralleled recognition of Christ as divine wisdom incarnate. These typological readings made an Old Testament figure relevant to Christian theology and devotion, ensuring her continued importance in Christian art and teaching. Beyond religious traditions, she represents something essential about human curiosity and cross cultural encounter. She traveled vast distances to verify reports about Solomon's wisdom. She asked hard questions rather than accepting claims uncritically. She recognized excellence when she found it and praised it generously. These qualities, curiosity, critical thinking, openness to learning, and graciousness in acknowledging others' achievements, remain admirable regardless of religious context. Her story also addresses power dynamics. As a woman ruling independently in patriarchal contexts, she challenges assumptions about female capability. Yet different traditions handle this challenge differently. Some emphasize her ultimate subordination to Solomon's superior wisdom. Others celebrate her autonomy and equality. The varying interpretations reveal ongoing tensions about gender, authority, and the relationship between male and female power. The romantic elements added by various traditions reflect human interest in whether power equals might feel personal attraction. Two impressive individuals meeting generates speculation about emotional and physical connection beyond formal diplomacy. Whether Solomon and the queen actually experienced romance matters less than what the question reveals about human assumptions that power, wisdom, and beauty naturally lead to desire. Modern feminism finds in her both inspiration and frustration. She inspires as an autonomous female ruler, engaging men as equals. She frustrates when traditions emphasize her beauty over her wisdom, or when narratives describe her manipulation into sexual situations. Contemporary retellings often try to reclaim her agency, presenting her as a fully autonomous figure whose choices drive her story rather than reacting to male initiatives. Post-colonial perspectives examine how European interpretation appropriated her legend, sometimes erasing African connections or imposing European aesthetic and moral frameworks onto African and Asian traditions. Reclaiming the Queen of Sheba means restoring non-European interpretations to prominence and recognizing how communities in Ethiopia, Yemen, and the broader Islamic world have understood her on their own terms rather than through colonial filters. The geographical debate between South Arabia and the Horn of Africa need not have a single answer. Perhaps multiple queens at different times contributed to the composite legend. Perhaps trade networks connected both regions so thoroughly that cultural exchange made Sheba a designation for commercial civilization spanning the Red Sea rather than a single kingdom. Perhaps the legend matters more than precise location, with both regions legitimately claiming connection to a tradition that transcends specific borders. Her legacy in wisdom literature extends beyond specific traditions. She established a template for how wisdom gets demonstrated and recognized. Her hard questions became archetypal for testing intellectual ability. Her satisfaction with Solomon's answers modeled how true wisdom recognizes excellence. The exchange between them illustrated that wisdom flourishes through encounter with other intelligent minds rather than isolation. The tale reminds us that ancient women achieved more than patriarchal texts usually acknowledge. If queens ruling independently existed in South Arabia, if female sovereigns appeared in Ethiopian tradition, if Islamic and Jewish sources accepted female political authority as possible even if unusual, then women's historical role included more political participation than simplistic readings of ancient societies suggest. She hints at forgotten female power that deserves recovery and recognition. Her mystery preserves her appeal. With so much unknown, each generation can reimagine her according to its values and concerns. She becomes what each era needs her to be: theological symbol, romantic heroine, feminist icon, embodiment of cross-cultural exchange, or simply a fascinating historical puzzle. This adaptability ensures her continuing relevance despite vast changes in how humans understand gender, power, and cultural difference. The Queen of Sheba thus transcends the historical questions surrounding her: whether she actually existed, where she ruled, what she looked like, whether she bore Solomon's child. All these questions remain open and possibly unanswerable. Yet her cultural existence is undeniable and enormously significant. She shaped religious thought, inspired artistic creation, legitimized political authority, and provided a model of female power across thousands of years. From a few verses in First Kings and Second Chronicles, she grew into a figure claimed by multiple faiths, nations, and artistic traditions. Ethiopian emperors traced their lineage through her. Islamic theology used her as an exemplar. Jewish wisdom tradition populated her story with elaborate details. Christian art depicted her for centuries. Modern scholars debate her location and legacy. Throughout all this, she remains elusive yet present, mysterious yet influential, uncertain historically yet certain culturally. Her story teaches that legends sometimes carry truths deeper than historical facts. She represents the human drive to seek wisdom, the possibility of female authority, the value of cultural exchange, and the ways stories shape identity. These lessons persist regardless of whether a woman named Bilqis or Makeda ever ruled Saba and visited Jerusalem. The legend itself became real through its effects on millions of believers, artists, and thinkers across continents and centuries. The Queen of Sheba endures because she answers needs that transcend specific times and places. Every era requires examples of wisdom sought and found. Every culture needs stories about encounters with otherness that end in mutual recognition.